more like a monologue, not motivation for our own lives, and that it is designed for entertainment. Now, I don't think our understanding of sermon here is like that, right? Would you say so? I know you're also doing some production work there. But this idea of sermon as clever, entertaining monologue could be in some places, but it's not. It's not here, I don't think. But that means being clever. The challenge of being clever in the sermon also might get in the way of really going deep where the parables are concerned. Dr. Levine offers this next one.
So let's back up for a second.
Because
we had a couple of audio issues there from the start.
All right.
So let's just go back to
the beginning of these problems.
The irony of our conversation that people couldn't hear is that we were talking about things that maybe we missed because we're not listening. So let's go back and let's just recap that a little bit of introduction.
As you know, Jamie is monitoring the production piece of this, so I can tell when something
under the bus.
I can only tell when something's gone wrong. But all right, so we're going to go back and just say what the reasons are that we can't hear the parables.
Yes.
Okay, start there.
Yes.
So the first one is most often we're introduced to it as a children's story. It appears in the children's message. It is part of pictures that you color in Sunday school. And if we were taught it and take it in as a child, we think we know. We think we know what this is about. Mm-hmm. And so we're not curious because we already know what it's about. So the children's story part. The next reason, according to Dr. Levine, that we can't really hear these parables is that many clergy do not take the time to develop the challenge of the parable.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about the time limit in a typical sermon. Mm-hmm. The preacher doesn't get to preach as long as the preacher might need, and that that's challenge. That's lazy behavior on the part of clergy.
I think it's a good excuse for not diving as deep as we could by saying, well, I've only got 15 minutes to preach, and this is the real point that I want to make, so I'm not going to do all of this.
And it could take 15 minutes, as we know, just trying to get these conversations ready. It takes more than 15 minutes. All right. So clergy not taking the time to develop the challenge of the parable is another reason we can't hear them. Reason number 3, congregations have come to believe the sermon is monologue, not motivation, and it's designed for entertainment. I'm not sure that's what University Christian Church thinks about sermons, but there is a trend to think of interesting ways to explain the teaching point and the need to be clever. Not that it's bad to be clever, but congregations may not want a sermon that does that hard work. Don't you think that's a good way to say it?
I would totally agree with that, and I would also say that I agree with you. I don't think that happens often here because our congregation holds us accountable for really doing some good heavy teaching from the pulpit.
Right.
But there are a lot of congregations out there where it is more of a show than a message.
So the trends in what congregations expect out of a sermon. Next reason for auditory atrophy. Clergy think that they are presenting a challenging message when in fact they are unintentionally repeating anti-Jewish stereotypes. That happens in our parable today.
It does.
So if that gets in the way, the message isn't going to be received as it was intended. We got to unpack all of that. The next reason that we can't hear the parables, the study of homiletics, that's preaching, is moving increasingly away from a historical critical focus on the biblical text and more toward practical theology. Agreed?
I think it depends on the seminary that you go to.
It depends on the church you attend.
Yes.
Now, this is Dr. Levine. I put quotation marks around each of these to make it very clear that I'm sharing with you what she is trying to convince us of, and I think there's truth in all of this. All right, next. Some of today's students of the Bible, Dr. Levine says, have tossed out all historical work. They prefer to find meanings from their own perspective. what the text might have meant to Jesus or to his first followers becomes either impossible or an irrelevant question. Do you think about this critique that we're getting from Dr. Levine? Do you think this will impact the next time you're teaching parables at church camp? Do you need me to share these notes for you so
Please,
that you
yeah,
don't?
I'll take your copy of these slides and leave them on my desk.
Please.
I think it's really easy for us to fall into our own kind of proof texting and our own, this is what it means to me, and so I'm going to apply this to
The Gospel
what I'm
according
teaching.
to Jamie.
Yeah, but that's not a book in the Bible, and so we should probably avoid that
Yes.
for the most part.
Now, what I thought as I was looking at those coloring pages and looking at the art that's been created around the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors, you can see in the way the artist depicts what's going on, that same kind of stereotypical thinking, a way that the story has been handled after it was first the story that Jesus told. What Luke has added to it, which we've talked about before. So I just wanted to show you some pictures. My mom says she likes it when I include some art in the Sunday school lesson. So, Mom, this is for you. So here's the first one. And I tried so hard this week to get the artist and the location of the art, and I came up with a 0. So maybe I need an art historian to volunteer to help us in the weeks ahead. All right, so here we have, in this first illustration, you can see how the Pharisee looking up to God for prayer, the tax collector looking down. There are other people on their knees, so they're in the temple. A lot of the other illustrations don't feature any other prayers. It's just the two of them. And you see a more upright posture and a more apologetic and contrite posture, but not too much difference between. Maybe the Pharisee looks more prosperous, right? Do you think?
I would say just moderately.
Well, Dr. Levine would argue
It's
that the
close.
tax collector probably had plenty of money.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, I'll show you. I won't say it. I'll show you. All right, look at the next picture. Is that this picture?
Mhm.
To get my pages right? All right. Now the Pharisee looks very haughty, doesn't he?
Yes.
And he is dropping some money into the offering plate, almost saying, hey, here is my tithe, 10% of everything. And looking up, very prosperous. I guess you're prosperous if you're rotund, right?
That's
In-
definitely a
In
signal
ancient art.
that you had enough to eat.
So he's looking up, he's dressed very formally, and there is the tax collector almost looks kind of like a beggar, do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Not only contrite, head bowed, but kind of ragged. He looks very ragged. All right, and Pharisee in the front in this picture. These next pieces of art I really love. You can see that the one on the left is a carving, maybe a panel, part of a series, a wood carving, but to represent two postures that way within that rectangle. Don't you love that?
That's really powerful.
Isn't that awesome? And we have the Pharisee not so grand and pompous here, I think, more a teacher, and the tax collector contrite and bowed in on himself in a way, really out of deference for where he is. In the next picture, the picture to the right, which I think is also interesting, the Pharisee could be in Fiddler on the Roof, couldn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Very, very grand, with his arms out. And look at the tax collector in that picture.
Very simple.
Very simple, very, like, what am I doing in here? Almost, in a way. Which does kind of touch on some of the way that Dr. Levine's going to teach us about this. So I think just in the art we see how the story's being told.
Mm-hmm.
How one character is taking a certain set of traits above and beyond the words that Jesus uses. Let's look at the words that Jesus uses. Here is the parable. It begins on verse 9 of Luke chapter 18. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Here's the parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. In the older translations, it was publican. That's the way probably it was when I was learning this. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves shall be humbled, all who humble themselves shall be exalted. So those are the words of the text, and one of the interesting things Dr. Levine says is that those conclusion sentences are floating sentences in various gospels that get tagged onto the ends of things. So it's a conclusion that may have been from another story Jesus told, or, it's almost as if the artistry of the gospel writer allowed for this closing line to be part of something else in Mark and something else in Matthew. Isn't that interesting?
That's very
So it's floating lines. So those lines, to really see what Jesus is teaching, those lines sometimes don't seem like they make sense. Have you ever read the lead into a parable and thought, well, that's not what this parable
That's a little
explains.
disjointed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are floating lines in the parables. All right, now some observations. Of course, we're going to talk about Luke again, as we have been, and I love the way that Dr. Levine talks about Luke. Here are some of her insights into this parable. We find ourselves now in the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and we have met numerous unlikable Pharisees and a number of quite darling tax collectors. I love that she writes that. When we read the Gospel, our sympathies are with the tax collector and not at all with the Pharisee. It's same with the artist who drew the Pharisee pictures. This is exactly the opposite stand from which a first century Jewish person would have heard the parable. For Luke, tax collectors are invariably sinners on their way to becoming saints. They're just in the transition. First century Jews would beg to differ with the way Luke depicts tax collectors. Our tax collector is a sinner, probably rich, an agent of Rome, and as a tax collector has probably shown no mercy. The presence of the tax collector in the temple is therefore unexpected. He was a traitor to his people. The government for which he worked, the Roman Empire, used the temple as its personal bank. Our tax collector is in the temple praying. Jesus has given us an image that unsettles. When we got to that conclusion, I tried to think of the kind of images, a photograph of the sanctuary at University Christian Church and somebody sitting there that would be so unsettling. What kinds of reasons could we be unsettled to even see that someone has come to God's house to pray? That's the way that the first century crowd would have received that tax collector even setting foot in the temple. Does that all align with how you understood the tax collector role, or were you rooting for him in this parable?
I think that we see a trend in the Gospels, as A.J. Levine points out, of who the tax collector we assume is going to be, and then we come to this text and we understand now from a first century perspective that this would have been very disconcerting for folk. And you go and you look throughout the Gospels and you see that this was the type of person that Jesus was gathering with. It's like, okay, well now we can start to draw some lines between the stories that we're seeing and the work that Jesus was doing.
I am very clear in my evangelical upbringing in the church that the message that I had about Pharisees were they were bad guys.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They had no value, and they were They were, always getting in the way of what Jesus was trying to do.
Mm-hmm. They were
they were bad guys. There was no redeeming quality about Pharisees.
And in ways that I heard it too growing up, not only were they bad guys, but they were the people in power that we were supposed to be resisting.
Yes.
And you think about that as anti-Semitic language today, that's very significant in some places.
So now we've got a kind of first century idea about the tax collector role. Let's look at what Dr. Levine has to say about the Pharisee in this parable. She says, the majority of Jesus' Jewish audience, for the majority, the Pharisee would have been a respected teacher, someone who walked the walk as well as talked the talk. And that's what I liked about that wooden carving we just saw, that the picture of the Pharisee there wasn't somebody who was lording it over everybody. All right. With regard to their sphere of influence, Pharisees were substantially village-based. The temple was the center of priestly power. The Pharisees weren't running the temple. The Pharisees were doing their teaching in the context of the village. So the Pharisee showing up in the temple would have not been immediately when all heads turn and everything is about the power of the Pharisee. Next, she writes, it is easy to compare the Pharisee to whatever population in your congregation is seen to be judgmental, parochial, bigoted, stuck in the mud, and otherwise unable to see the newness of the good news. The problem is that the good news should not be based on bad history. Wow. So we've got a kind of stereotypical problem here, a big one. Now, listen to how the first century listeners to Jesus' story would have understood what it is the Pharisee prays about. The Pharisee, Dr. Levine writes, has gone beyond even the strictest of strict understandings of Torah when he thanks the Lord that he does, and we looked at those words a minute ago. No text in Torah requires that everything be tithed, nor is there any requirement for twice a week fasting. For first century Jews, Jesus' description of this particular Pharisee would have been taken as a humorous representation, almost a caricature of a saint. Kind of, I'm thinking as we tell stories, the person who could do no wrong and you just load it on, but what he's praying about, no Jew was required to observe in the way that he was. So he was not really, Jesus wasn't really talking about a real person. Does that change this? Everybody would chuckle like, oh, yes.
Like, okay, this is, we see what you're doing.
Yes.
All right, we get the point.
It would have not been an actual representation at all. All right, now, however, we have been led to see these two men. They've come to the temple to pray, and Dr. Levine wants to address now the fact that they're both in the temple praying. For both men in the temple, in the parable, the temple is a place of prayer. It is a place where God is found, where fidelity can be celebrated, your obedience to God's law, and reconciliation can be found, where Jewish distinction can be proclaimed over and against Roman insistence on assimilation, on wiping out all the differences. It is the same place where Jesus' followers continued to worship after his crucifixion. And I think as she's making this explanation, I'm also unpacking anti-temple positioning in the way those stories were told.
Yeah.
And no, this is a holy place, and both of those men are welcome to pray there, and they're both there for the purpose of prayer, which is what the temple is all about. So no suspicion about this place where they've gone to talk to God. No suspicion is deserving there.
What I've noticed about this whole series to this point is that there is so much opportunity to deconstruct the things that we were taught poorly, and if we just take the time to do a little bit of research, we can find a whole new context and a whole new space in which to reinterpret some of these traditional parables that we know in new, life-giving, really vibrant ways. And that, I think, what you just named about this was a place where they both were allowed to be.
Where God could be found, where God could meet them where they were.
Like, that's so simple of a
Yeah.
thought, but it was ingrained in us from an early age to not think that way about this situation.
That is exactly true. And think how challenged we're going to be. This is another reason why, even though it's challenging, I would love for you all to get this book. Because we're doing our own humble, not adequate job. But I will never be able to hear the parables that we've worked on in a sermon.
I'm gonna have a lot more questions
You
about
know,
that now.
it's just a game changer for me, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry,
All right.
that was a tangent. I apologize.
No, I think that's very important about the temple, and it really got my attention this week. Here's Dr. Levine again. How we assess the Pharisee may well tell us more about ourselves than it does about him. Yet, whatever we conclude, we should note that the address is still to God. The Pharisee is calling upon God, and the gratitude is still expressed to God. I almost got the impression in the Pharisee that that was a prayer for everybody to hear. He was making a speech. He wasn't praying.
Yeah.
He was making a speech about how wonderful he was. And she's reminding us he was speaking to God, and he was giving thanks to God. The way he was doing it may not be the way that we would have expressed it. Now, I've already talked to you about the floating sentence there, right? In
Yes.
the next slide. So we'll move on.
Okay.
But here's the big thing. It's possible the translation isn't exactly right
Uh-oh.
about the most important part of this parable. And so it's about the sentence that is now in front of you. Do we?
Yes, it's
All right. And it's about the words that are underlined. And it's possible in the original language that it could mean either of these two, and more likely, Dr. Levine is about to explain, it is the second. Now, what's the difference? What is the difference in the parable if the second is actually the way Jesus told the story, and we have had a little bit of an interpretation translation problem? We understood the story as, I tell you, this is Jesus speaking, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other one. All right, tax collector got a gold star from God, and the Pharisee just wasted his time, even going to the temple. Or could it be this? I tell you, this man went down to his home justified because of the other. Now, are you intrigued to know how it could be? I'm not going to give you the linguistic explanation,
I'm ready.
but Dr. Levine is going to explain why the more accurate, historically correct translation is probably the tax collector benefited
because of the
from the
Pharisee.
holiness of the Pharisee.
All right.
Here's how that works. Judaism is a communitarian movement, Dr. Levine reminds us, in which each member of the community is responsible for the other. That means the sin of one person can negatively impact everything else, and at the same time, it means the good deeds of one person can have a positive impact on the lives of others. That means the holiness and the faithfulness, the obedient life of the Pharisee could be appropriated to help raise up the tax collector's faults and problems and disloyalty, that through osmosis, in a way, through community osmosis, there's a leveling of the people who need some work on their faith and the people who are walking the walk and talking the talk.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think it's a really foreign concept for modern Christians because we focus so much on the individuality of faith,
Yes.
on personal relationship with Jesus, and on our own ability to walk alongside God, that we sometimes overly separate the actions of one person from the actions of another, when in reality it is a communal effort. And we talk a lot about reasons that we all give to the church and the work that the church does in the world. And we have this kind of ancillary sense of community, but in reality for us, we are very individualistic.
Yes.
And that's incredibly counter to
this is very
what AJ
different.
is talking
And here's
about.
the way Dr. Levine explained it in a contemporary explanation that I thought was really helpful. Say that you're a middle school kid and you're put on a team with 3 other kids and you're going to do a science project. Did that ever happen to you?
So many times.
And so the stereotypical understanding of how this works would be, and maybe it's how the teacher gathers the groups, there'll be one really smart kid, right? Maybe that was you when you were in middle school. And there will be 2 kind of average kids in this group in terms of academic performance, and then there will be one kid who's really struggling,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the really smart kid feels like he or she is having to drag these other 3 people along, and if the project gets to an A, it's because the smart kid delivered and they were just hanging on. The kid who struggles academically may have offered his or her best to the project,
Yeah.
but the best wasn't as good as the worst of the smart kid. But the grade was given to all 4.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the same way, the Pharisee, holy and righteous before God, and the tax collector praying to be forgiven because he's a sinner, the tax collector is like the struggling kid and is pulled up because of the understanding of community in Judaism, is pulled up into the circle, more into the circle of obedience.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and doesn't that signal that we have like a heightened sense of responsibility for each other? Like we should really be looking out for one another and making sure that we're
not competitive
Yeah,
at
it's
all.
not a competition to see who's more
Now,
righteous.
of course, part of the problem is he says, God, thank you for not making me like this list of really bad people or this tax collector.
Yeah.
You know, that's maybe he didn't have good people skills.
Or just was frustrated with being the one that was pulling everyone else along.
And if he was a cheater, I mean, if he was an agent for Rome, don't think I want to be like him either, Lord.
But
So-
how often too did that straight A student go to the teacher and say, "Look, I really did probably
They didn't do
85%
anything.
of this work. They didn't respond
Yes.
to any of my texts. They made it to one group meeting at
Yes.
the very beginning. So really, I should get
Just
the
give
A, and they
me
should
the
get
A.
C."
Don't give them an A. We have so many. As soon as you start telling a story like that, we all go back to
Yes.
school again, and we're in middle school, and for one reason or another, we feel like we haven't gotten our due. So look at what Dr. Levine says next. We cannot fully identify with either the Pharisee, who will continue to behave in a righteous manner, far beyond what most people will do, or the currently repentant tax collector, who may continue to do things wrong. Once we judge one as better than the other, we are trapped by this parable. I love that. The types of generosity shown by a God, this is such a great paragraph. This is why I wanted you to see her words. The type of generosity shown by a God who makes the sun shine on the just and the unjust alike. The type of generosity that allows the tax collector to tap into the good deeds of the Pharisee. That's what we want for ourselves, but we don't want others to have it. We want God to be extremely generous to us, but not that guy over there. And we know deep down that our sense of justice is limited. You know, the generous God who is listening to the tax collector in the same way that God is listening to the Pharisee. No, we think God really listens to the Pharisee more. And here's the conclusion from Amy Jill Levine at the end of this parable. We are left without full resolution, which is what a good parable should do. So we're just unpacking our own judgment about the smart student and the struggling student and where we are in the mix, and wanting God's generosity to continue to flow to us, and we can't be as generous with our brothers and sisters who are in different positions. So What do you think about that? Oh my gosh. The difference in that translation,
It's significant.
justified because of the righteousness of the Pharisee.
This is why I'm always a little suspicious of people who seem to have it all figured out. Because there are so many things
So
that
many
we
twists and
just
turns and-
cannot possibly have the answer to. That a healthy dose of questioning is almost necessary to have a healthy faith life.
Amen, brother. That's a good summary. That's a good summary. And I am thinking about how I've been taught this story in particular, and trying to peel off those layers now. And looking forward to the next time I hear somebody preach this parable, and hoping that they will have also read this book.
Maybe send it to them beforehand.
Here,
Hey, I
please.
heard you were going to
Would
preach
you
on
like
the
to have
Pharisee and the
this
tax collector.
So we're looking forward to next week. We hope you will be with us. The parable is...
The laborers and the vineyard.
Oh, I've never liked that parable.
I haven't either, but I think we're going to start liking it more next week.
Awesome. Be with us again next week. We love having you with us. Let's close with prayer. God, we are challenged in so many ways. And those of us who love to spend time in your word in a Sunday school class now see that some of the time that we have spent has included information that hasn't allowed us to truly understand what your son was teaching us, what your son still is saying to the world around us and to us. So open our hearts and our ears and our mind as we continue to seek your word for us this day. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. See you soon. Stay safe.